I'm thrilled to welcome you to this World Environment Day Forum. Were it not for the current pandemic raging around our world, we would be gathered together in Honolulu to celebrate 75 years of Rotary and the UN's collaboration and 50 years of UNEP's World Environment Day. Instead, we are gathered together virtually in yet another Zoom room. Today's co-hosts are Chris Puttock, ESRAG's chair, Patricia Armstrong, our membership director, and I, Karen Kendrick-Hand's communications director. Our celebration of 50 years of World Environment Day is tempered, as we also pause to mourn the loss of victims of racial injustice and violence, as well as the nearly 400,000 people who have already lost their lives to the viral pandemic of COVID-19. We empathize with the families who love them and the communities that have suffered their loss, our loss. Both of these crises are fruits of inequitable access to resources, an ecosystem ravaged by the web of biodiversity, which we come together. Our climate, which has nurtured humanity for 10,000 years, is at a tipping point. We humans have disregarded the laws of physics and failed to act with empathy to our fellow beings and all life on the planet. The harms from these lapses fall disproportionately on people of color and the disadvantaged. Yet, as Rotarians and members of ESRAG, we act in hope to offer our service above self in the face of these intertwined challenges. Today's speakers will focus on solutions. Daniel Cooney and Elizabeth Mullins-Bernhardt from the UN Environment Program, Joe Richardson, who's engaging youth in schools, in Rotary programs, and ESRAG's own Climate Solution Coalition to reduce food waste. As Rotary is poised to add the environment as an area of focus, Jonathan Foley of Project Drawdown will inspire us with examples of existing, proven, scalable solutions to address the climate crisis. And in honor of all those who have ever planted a tree, we will learn from Brandon Foley of Greening Australia about the hope of recovery after Australia's devastating bushfires. ESRAG is one of Rotary's 29 action groups. Formed from Rotarians and their friends around the globe around a common mission. For us in ESRAG, it's to promote environmental sustainability and respond to climate change. Members on the call, engage your regional chapter. Form an environment committee in your club or district. Join one of our growing project teams. And if you're on this call and not already a member, join. And it wouldn't be a Rotary event if I didn't say you are welcome to donate at any time to support our work by going to esrag.org. ESRAG had the privilege of and honor of being asked by Barry Rassin, past president of Rotary International, to work with UNEP to create a handbook to help Rotarians celebrate World Environment Day. It's a compilation of 11 projects, and God willing and the creeks don't rise, the Spanish version will be on our website by the end of June 5th, our celebration this year to World Environment Day. The handbook is a great starting point for your Rotary Club and helps and cuts across all of our current areas of focus and prepares us to welcome, hopefully, the environment as another one. And now, in honor of our great partnership with UNEP and their spokespeople, Liz and Daniel, I'm going to start to roll the tape.
So firstly, I'd like to start by having some discussion about the United Nations Environment Program so that we actually know what it is and what its goals are.
Just before I dive into talking about UNEP, maybe I should actually say that Liz and I actually have a background with Rotary. I had the immense privilege of being a Rotary Peace Fellow, and I had a fellowship that put me through graduate school, and I was incredibly lucky to be able to go to the University of California, Berkeley, and do a Master's of Public Policy. And I think, Liz, you were a Rotary Scholar, right?
I went from my hometown, a small town, to University of Geneva's Graduate School for International Relations. So Rotary, I really have to thank for putting me on my career path at the UN.
And I was, when I was at doing my graduate school and doing a Master's of Public Policy, my goal was to use the skills that I was learning there and go on and work, on using communication and advocacy to inform environmental policy. And after a journey, I've ended up here at UN Environment Program, Director of Communication. So, Chris, to answer your question, who are we? Who is UNEP, as we are referred to by the acronym? Well, we're the voice for the environment within the United Nations system, and we have 196 member states who are our boss, and the member states set our policy and direction. But we're the leading authority and decision-making body on the environment within the United Nations. Every 18 months or so, all of our member states come together at which, just like the UN General Assembly, is when the world comes together and sets the global environmental direction and policy. Now, our mandate is incredibly broad. A mandate to focus on everything from climate change to nature and biodiversity, to pollution, chemicals and waste, and a range of other issues. But despite the sort of breadth of our mandate, we're not a large organization. We're only about 1,200 staff in our secretariat, but we're also home to 15 multilateral environment agreements, as they're known. Things like the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Ozone Secretariat, and the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. So we're not a big organization by UN standards, but we've got a large mandate. And so it's a big job.
Rotary is largely a humanitarian organization. And we have, by setting up the Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group, have actually tried to bring into Rotary more of the environment. So basically, your mandate is broad, and we are doing basically what is being missed by the humanitarian side of Rotary. And so what we are doing now is trying to capture some of those areas, particularly the climate change and the things that lead to climate change within our mandate of human health and managing humanitarian issues. So we know that you've set up the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so one of the things I'd really like to look at is what those sustainability goals are, and how we are in Rotary not hitting some of those things right now, and where ESRAG and United Nations Environment Program can work together to capture some of those spaces. So, Liz, if you could help us through those Sustainable Development Goals.
Sure, I'm happy to, Chris. And you might see that I've got my little SDG pin on here. So the SDGs, in many ways, are they're our marching orders. They're our holy book, our bread and butter of what we do. The SDGs are a set of very ambitious goals that were put into place in 2015, and they have a deadline of 2030. So they're 15-year goals. You might have heard of the predecessor to the SDGs, which is something known as the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals had as an ambition to have quite a number of situations in the world, you know, having poverty, or cutting in half the number of children who die under the age of 5, or cutting in half the number of children who don't finish primary school. So they were a set of goals that were quite ambitious, and they were reached for the most part. The Sustainable Development Goals are really taking it up another level, because they have as an ambition, there are 17 of them, first of all, but they have as an ambition universal coverage. You know, their ambition is really no hunger, universal education, clean water and sanitation for all. They are extremely ambitious. What's exciting about the SDGs, they were agreed by all the UN. They agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals. They are universal. So the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to be for every country in the world, every person in that country. And the SDGs are also indivisible. So it's widely accepted that you cannot achieve, for example, peace and security without getting universal access to water for the world's population. So these SDGs speak to each other. They're intricately interlinked. So these three concepts of their ambition, their universality, and their interlinkedness are core to that SDG agenda. And they really cover, when I was actually in the General Assembly on that day in September 2015 when the SDGs were passed. And the guy next to me turned to me and said, wow, the SDGs, they really cover everything but the kitchen sink. And then another, actually, they do cover the kitchen sink. The kitchen sink is mentioned in this SDG on hand washing, right, in this goal for health. So they are very much extremely comprehensive as a set of goals. And for us, everyone in the UN system, they are something that we're all working towards achieving. First time is bring together the traditional agendas of social and economic development, which is how the UN has tended to think of development for the last 75 years. And it brings the environmental aspect in at an equal level. So the SDGs are really equally social, economic, and environmental. Now, when you walk through them, and starting with number 1, they kind of start off as more, I would say, more social SDGs. You know, they're more social goals that we've had for a very long time. For example, eradicating poverty is number 1. Having no hunger is number 2. Universal health is goal. Number 4, SDG 4, has to do with ensuring quality education for all. Goal number 5 is for gender equality and maternal health. SDG number 6, here that's the blue one here, the light blue one on the right, is entirely dedicated to achieving universal access to clean drinking water and sanitation. SDG number 7, you see this nice little light bulb in yellow, is for access to clean energy. And it's these goals, numbers 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, which really have to do with the economic. So this is where you go kind of from the social goals, these traditional, the economic realm. So number 8 has to do with encouraging local economies. Number 9 is infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure. Number 10 is reducing inequalities within countries. And number 11 is for sustainable, we call that the cities goal. And then I would say that it's almost this last set of goals, number 12, 13, 14, 15, those are really UNEP's bread and butter. These are pretty much the environmental goals. Number 12 has to do with how we produce and consume. So it's sustainable consumption and production as societies. Number 13 is for climate action. And so if you've heard of the Paris Convention and the climate change agenda, that is embedded within goal 13 in the SDGs. They are in fact one and the same. Number 14 is to protect our oceans. Goal 15 is to protect life on land, including biodiversity. And then 16 is for peace, justice, and inclusive societies. Those are the main SDGs. Number 17 is one that really cuts across all of them. Number 17 is for partnerships. And really what that means is that we understand that rich countries need to work with poor. Countries in the global south need to work with others in the global south. The UN needs to work with the private sector, with civil society, with organizations like Rotary. So I see our collaboration with Rotary a core part of Goal 17.
Well, that's really good. What I see in what you presented and is that Rotary up till now has been largely looking at the goals 1 through 11, say, and then the environmental goals are the ones that come on the end of that. And this is where ESRAG and environmental sustainability is really coming in to address these goals from Rotary side of things. And so this is very exciting that we can actually collaborate and see up of matching Rotary's ambitions with those of the United Nations, whereas previously we were missing quite a number of them towards the end.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, you guys have been around for a really long time, and the things you've been focusing on, your 6 focus areas that you have now, you can match them directly with some of these SDGs that I just mentioned. You know, water and sanitation provision, for example, and peace and conflict prevention, maternal and child health. Those are things that are core to what we do at the UN, and I feel like Rotary has understood for a long time that they're fundamental to peaceful societies. And I think, though, a lot of what you've been doing so far and doing very well does have strong environmental connections, like tree planting. And I know that Rotary is also very active in providing hand washing facilities and clean water and sanitation access and solar power. And so I think with a more of an explicit focus on the environment, you can really put some of that work front and center. One
of the things I see that's really going to be happening with in the future, we've just gone through this COVID-19 pandemic. It's still going to be ongoing for quite some time. And often what we've had previously when we've had these crises is it creates a recession of some sort and a lot of pressure. And the pressure leads to the environment. There's various controls that have been established to maintain the environment are eroded so that people can get re-established in some way or another. So perhaps we can talk about some examples of how Rotary can be environmental stewards. And
many of us have been reading, articles about the environment in the media in the past couple of months, and greenhouse gases are down. Air quality is improving, stories about animals on the streets of our cities and dolphins in waterways, and it's great. The global, this global lockdown has been giving people a taste of what life could be like in a cleaner environment. But the COVID-19 is there's no real silver lining for the environment here. This is not to safeguard the environment. The decline in greenhouse gases is a fraction of what we need if we're going to really tackle climate change. And look, this emergency is primarily a health emergency, and secondly, there's increasing awareness that planetary health equals human health. And the numbers of people who are dying every year because of air pollution, water pollution, is absolutely astronomical. And we have an opportunity here that we can do it in a way that and I think that many countries are seeking to make that shift. We've seen some very promising moves in countries in Asia and Europe. But we also see some concerning steps in which environmental safeguards, pollution laws are being weakened, and that's something of real concern. And I think that a lot of these regulations are at subnational levels, and Rotary can have a real hand in making it clear to leaders in countries how the environment is so closely tied to the welfare of society today. It's important that Rotarians have the voice, make it clear what they want to see, and help to shape this the society that we're going to build back from as we build out of this crisis. So Liz, you want to take over from there?
I absolutely agree. I think it's important for those of us who care about the environment, which is obviously people like us here at UNEP and people that are in the ESRAG at Rotary, that we're not rejoicing for the environment right now. I think that what we're seeing as some potential gains have come at a very high cost for people and their livelihoods. And a region like part of the world like where we live in, Dan and I are based here at our headquarters in Nairobi in Kenya, which corresponds to the Rotary District 9212 for these 4 countries in our region. A city like Nairobi, 80% of the people live in informal settlements. That's our best guess. And people living in informal settlements are often in extremely vulnerable positions. They might live 8 to 10 people in a home. Social distancing is a luxury that they can't afford. People, they go out and break a curfew or lockdown in order to be able to have food to feed their families. And many people, especially in informal settlements, just don't have access to clean water, to wash their hands, to even take basic precautions, to protect themselves against COVID. So it's really a critical situation, life or death situation for many people here. But while I don't want to say there's a silver lining, I think that what we're seeing come out of this crisis, there are quite a few things that I think are actually quite inspirational. One of them is that the world can act quickly, that all over the world, that countries are learning from each other. A second thing I think is really positive to see is how important it is for communities to help each other. This role of local action, like Dan just said, I think this is exactly where Rotary, an organization like Rotary, which is local people caring about their communities, it's a very inspirational model to see. And one thing we're seeing in this region, Rotary is playing a fantastic role. I know that Rotary clubs here are raising money for personal protection equipment. They're raising money for food donations, for donating soap. They are setting up hand washing stations for populations. So Rotary is really on the front line here in our part of the world, and that's a fantastic thing to see.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So Daniel, this year is the year of Biodiversity Nations Environment Program. What's the emphasis for biodiversity for you?
Well, even before this COVID-19 crisis, there were 1 million species that scientists have warned may go extinct in the short to medium term, out of a total of 8 million. So we are on the verge of a major breakdown in biodiversity, in nature. And a lot of people might be like, I think there's a lack of awareness in the public in general about why that's important and why that's a crisis. And even just looking at the COVID-19, and that is that's a zoonotic disease, which means it's a virus that's jumped from animals to people. And it's a result of the breakdown in biodiversity. It's the breakdown in nature, and scientists are warning that we're seeing more and more diseases, zoonotic diseases, jumping from nature to people. 70%, and so that's a direct result of this breakdown that we're seeing in nature. And our continued erosion of wild spaces, of primary forests, of our ecosystems, and that it's bringing people closer and closer to the sort of, as they're called, these reservoir hosts of diseases and viruses. And so, it's June 5 is World Environment Day. Yes, the theme is biodiversity. We're running a global campaign called Time for Nature. And we're calling on people all around the world to make their voices heard about why it is time for nature. And that can be as simple as, well, I like going for a walk in the forest or along a beach, or it can be something a little bit more existential, such, talking about how nature is absolutely critical for our food systems, for the water that we drink, the air we breathe. Nature, about how jobs in the world are in some way tied to nature. And so the world has all of the science and the technical know-how and the finance to reimagine, reposition our relationship with nature. What we lack is the political will. And so this World Environment Day, we are calling on the world for people to make their voices heard, to make it clear about why we need our society to be living in harmony with nature, not against nature. And it's totally within our grasp. It's doable. And we've chosen biodiversity, the theme of biodiversity this year, because the world was expected, countries were expected in November to come together for a global meeting in China to set the next biodiversity conservation targets for the next decade. And these are important because this is the world agreeing on what levels of conservation there needs to be. Now, because of the COVID crisis, that meeting in China has been postponed. It'll probably happen sometime in 2021, but it is absolutely critical that countries come into that meeting with ambition and with real commitment to action. Because if that doesn't happen, if we don't come out of this meeting with a strong post-2020 biodiversity framework, we are on the verge of mass extinction, and that is a major threat to our societies. So we really need people. We need Rotary. We need all sorts of civil society to step up, make their voices heard, and help be part of the solution.
Well, thank you. That's a really good place to round off our discussion this morning. One of the things I do want to mention is that United Nations Environment Program has a really excellent newsletter, and that comes out monthly. And I'd really like our audience and everybody to subscribe to the newsletter so that those developments that Daniel has been talking about and Liz will actually be seen by so many more people. And this will be a really great place to get the new information to you and distributed. This is really great.
Chris, can I just jump in for 1 sec, just to say, just to give a shout out for ESRAG and the great leadership that ESRAG is playing within the Rotary system, and also a shout out for this handbook that we developed with ESRAG last year. And if you'll permit me just to share this, this is the handbook that UN Environment Program produced last year with ESRAG. Liz, myself, and many other colleagues invested a lot of hours working with Christopher, Karen, and other colleagues in ESRAG. And I understand that Rotary's now translated this into Spanish ideas of what clubs can do around the world on how to just take on a project that's focused on the environment, from planting trees to safeguarding and looking after your water systems. There's a whole lot of ideas there. It's on ESRAG's website, so I do urge clubs to go and check it out and see where you can go with it.
Well, thank you very much. This is really great, and I hope that we're going to have further conversations like this.
Thanks so much, Chris. Pleasure speaking
Thanks,
to
Liz.
you.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was an amazing presentation from Daniel Cooney and Liz Bernhardt Mullins. And now I'm thrilled to pass the torch to Chris Puttick, who will introduce our next speaker.
Yes, so I'd like to introduce this by saying that the world is about to face food shortages, and due to the catastrophe that is the world COVID-19 pandemic. And as though we're not been managing our food to market and market to table and landfills efficiently prior to now, there are numerous opportunities for Rotarians to get involved in better management of food delivery and food waste. Our speaker Richardson addresses how we can manage and engage young people in recycling and prevention of food waste. Joe and his wife Nancy own T-Bar Holdings, which serves over 2,500 children in their before and after school programs, and 1,200 children in their 7 summer day camps every year. The Richardsons are ardent community builders, and their programs become a bedrock of Montgomery County and Frederick County in Maryland, USA. Joe founded the Mountainside Education and Enrichment, a nonprofit that teaches environmental stewardship and sustainability to children young and old. He serves on the Frederick Council Sustainability Commission for 6 years. He's a member of the Maryland Association of Environmental and Outdoor Education, and a member of the American Camp Association and the Maryland Agricultural Education Foundation. In addition to that, the Frederick County Compost Work Group. At the request of the county executive, he served the What's Next steering committee, examining solid waste solutions. He's been a Rotarian for 7 years and currently is the president of the Rotary Club of Southern Frederick. So now I'll hand it over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm really honored to be here, and I know that I'm representing all of ESRAG as a Rotarian and what we can physically do in our communities. When I joined Rotary, I was involved in being a community builder, and now I realize what a global community we live in, how interconnected we are, and how dependent we are on each other to solve these huge crises that we face. For the sake of expediency and making a fluid presentation, I pre-recorded a video that underscores some of the things that we've been doing with Lunch Out of Landfills, and I'll share that video with you now.
I'm an environmental educator. I'm a member of the Maryland Association of Environmental and Outdoor Educators. We run summer camps. We're community builders, and our real mission is to connect children to nature. At Mountainside, we incorporate 18 of the 80 solutions proposed in Drawdown, from sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, sustainable architecture, growing food in a sustainable way, composting, among others. In 2016, I was asked to serve on the Solid Waste Steering Committee by the County Executive Jan Gardner. The county was going to build a waste-to-energy incinerator, which had a great deal of opposition from the community. After a 2-year investigation holding public forums, the conclusions were to try to first get the organics out of the waste stream, to have an actual 3-bin system where we would have trash, recycle, and compost. But our community is not good at recycling for a variety of reasons, and we can't contaminate the waste stream. To do so, we would need to have a partner who would be able to compost the material and a place to take it. In 2018, I was approached by Elizabeth McCook, the environmental ed teacher at Urbana High School, who wanted to start a compost program and engage her students in meaningful, sustainable action. And we launched the program that January with good results. And we were diverting as much as 50% of the waste from that program. It was a great start. We also took the students to the landfill 64 miles away in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, so they could see the end place where all that waste went to. In January of 2019, my Rotary Club, Southern Frederick, came through with some funding so that I could sustain the program at Urbana High School, but also launch a program at Urbana Sugarloaf. We held an assembly, engaging the students so they understood why we were doing it, and we showed them how to source separate. So the students pictured here, every day would go into the cafeteria, they would pull the containers out, they would weigh them. The data was absolutely critical in being able to create a much more compelling story. What's pictured now is a typical trash can at a lunch period. So you've got a mishmash of everything. This is what it looked like beforehand. After 2 weeks, the children became much more efficient at separating their organics. I want you to notice that not only is there a clean waste stream, but there's an enormous amount of food that went into the trash untouched. The other photograph shows a clean recycle stream. Unfortunately, most of the plastics that are produced in the United States today are not recyclable. In the case of Frederick County, we were instructed that the children could only recycle the milk containers, water bottles, and cardboard containers that juices came in. We went from 19,002 pounds of trash that was generated from January to June to just 2,997 pounds that was landfill designated. Almost 85% was diverted, and this is where we began to see the need to look at a broader picture. That spring, as we're beginning to see the results from Urbana, we conducted waste sorts at a variety of other schools. To really start a program, you have to look at what you're doing. So we went to 4 schools with the volunteers of high schoolers from Brunswick High School. And we went in and we sorted waste. It's a very unpleasant, yucky job, but the students were very engaged and anxious to be able to do something that made a difference. With funding from the 6 Frederick County Rotary Clubs, a matching district grant, and a contribution of $10,000 from Frederick County Public Schools, we were able to launch programs in 14 schools in the fall of 2019. The successful launch of the program was going to require not only funding, but volunteers, and the Rotarians again came to the rescue. We set up the program by having volunteers in the cafeteria every day for 2 weeks, helping the kids to sort the waste properly in the appropriate containers. I wanted to show you how excited the kids were to be engaged, to be able to do something meaningful. The enthusiasm was palpable. This is not glamorous. It's very yucky work to filter through lunch that 20 minutes before was perfectly edible, and when once mixed with liquids, became pretty gross and disgusting. During the course of this program, throughout the fall, I was at schools on a regular basis, and I began to notice that kids were not drinking the milks or all the fluids they were given. They weren't even opening them. We didn't have an option in cases where we could give the milk back to the food services personnel. So the kids had no choice but to throw the material away. So we instructed the students, if they didn't open their milk, if they didn't drink their milk, to open the container, pour the liquids out, and put it in a recycle bin. You cannot recycle a container that has liquids in it. But I began to notice that there were a lot of unopened containers that kids were pouring out. So I got together with Mike Bonitsky from the school board and Alicia Mason-Fewer from the Frederick County Farm to School program to take a closer look. One Monday, we went to Lincoln Elementary School, a Title I school, a school that comes from a food-distressed community where we thought there would be less food waste. But at Lincoln Elementary School in particular, we were seeing greater amounts of food being uneaten, especially fruits, rolls. We partnered with the Frederick Rescue Mission and took the food there. When they asked us where the food came from, it was from the elementary school 4 blocks away. And the data that came from this was absolutely jaw-dropping. This program ran at Lincoln Elementary School for 38 days. In 38 days, we were able to recover 2,508 milks from Lincoln Elementary School in 38 days. That's an average of 64 milks. When you project that average out over a 180-day school year, we were throwing away as many as 11,500 milks annually from one school. In Frederick County, there are 40 elementary schools. In the state of Maryland, there are over 1,600 elementary schools. This is symptomatic of a problem that is occurring not only in Maryland, but throughout the United States. We have federally mandated food programs that schools are to implement. Food services are not allowed to take material back if unconsumed. And in many instances, the schools discourage share tables so that students who would want to drink a second milk or another apple are not given access to do that. It's imperative that we begin to reintroduce share tables, that we do everything we can to recover untouched, uneaten items and get them to communities that need them for milk that's not being consumed. The opportunity to have students be offered milk instead of having it automatically served is another way that savings can be gleaned and fewer products will be improperly disposed. The most important thing we as Rotarians, as citizens, can do is to roll up our sleeves, go into the schools, and see the magnitude of the problem. Until you really see it firsthand, you can't understand how grave the issue is, how nonsensical it is, and how easily remedied it can be. In March of 2019, I attended a Chesapeake Pets training in Alexandria, Virginia for Rotary incoming presidents. At that training, Mark Maloney, the Rotary International president, was in attendance. I had the opportunity in a brief encounter to encourage him to have Rotarians begin to embrace climate change and food recovery and to adopt practices in Drawdown. I'm pictured handing him a Drawdown book. I was gratified to see that within a month in the Rotarian magazine, Climate Solutions Within Our Reach was a featured article. It emphasized why climate change is Rotary's business, and it cited several of the Drawdown solutions as options that we could begin engaging Rotarians and the communities. 2 weeks later, I had the opportunity to attend a climate symposium at the National Geographic in Washington, D.C. Andrew Revkin hosted the event, and Catherine Wilkinson was one of the featured speakers from Drawdown. She coined a phrase that has resonated with me since, solutionist. The most important component here is that we're collecting data, that we have the story, that we have compelling information that makes us take a look and reflect on what we're doing and that we need to change. I want to focus on Greta Thunberg, who is nominated to be Person of the Year by Time magazine. This young teenager from Sweden has launched the Climate Strikers, an enormous climate awareness movement of students. The message is clear, the message is concise, and it's laced with anger. What we need to do is we need to channel that activism, which is so prevalent with these Friday strikes, to becoming solutions, which is exactly one of the solutions that we're proposing in Lunch Out at Landfills. ESRAG, the Environmental Sustainable Rotary Action Group, has partnered with these young students, Julia Casoul from Montpellier, France, and Candelaria de Paula from Buenos Aires, to form a Climate Solutions Coalition. ESRAG is providing a website where students can begin to communicate with each other to look at solutions that are appropriate for their community, whether it be mitigating the impact of plastics, more sustainable agricultural practices, and everything that we can do to minimize our carbon footprint. The beauty of this movement is that students, again, from around the world can communicate with one another and share each other's projects and successes. I want to introduce you to a couple of students in the Maryland area that are having a profound impact in the same way that Julia and Candelaria are with the Climate Solutions Coalition. She is Rustia Mula. As a 7th grader, she took the initiative to speak to the principal at Clarksburg Elementary School, a feeder school, to start a compost program there. She secured funding, reached out to me and Phil Westcott from Key Compost, and began a program in November of 2018. The next student I want to introduce is Kate Quigley. She attends Churchill High School. She's a member of the Churchill Climate Group, and she took the initiative to speak to the principal, building services, reached out to me to institute a waste sort and begin a program at Churchill High School all on her own, finding funding just as Shrusti had done. The program was ready to launch just before the pandemic hit. Despite her frustration, this program will be launched in the fall of 2020. The next student I want to introduce you to is Loretta Donahue. As a senior at Brunswick High School, she was the person who initiated 4 of the waste sorts in that community and gave me invaluable data to go to the superintendent of schools and initiate the 14 schools that ensued this past year. The last student I want to introduce you to is Amber Carrera. She's been involved with Lunch Out of Landfills since its inception at Urbana High School in 2018. She also testified before the Maryland State Legislature and the Ways and Means Committee advocating for a compost bill submitted by Delegate Alice Kane. One of the most important things that she had done is she reinvigorated the program in Urbana. The data at Urbana had begun to see more contamination and lower percentages of waste diversion. She personally took it upon herself. She got signatures from 1,000 of her fellow students at Urbana to recommit to do a better job of waste diversion and composting. The point to be made here is that as Rotarians, our job is to educate, to inspire, to give students meaningful projects they can engage in, to give them recognition, as evidenced by this photograph where Loretta Donahue is recognized by the Sustainability Commission, and then get out of the way. These students are hungry, desperate for change. I'm personally committed to this for the remainder of my life. The last image I'll show you is my grandchildren. I'm fearful for their future. They deserve to live in a world that I inherited, the same world filled with biodiversity and the beauty of the planet. They're entitled to that, and we're obligated to give that.
Okay, so I have just a few minutes, but some of the things that I wanted to try to mention is that Lunch Out of Landfills, Lunch Out of Landfills started out with 800 students, maybe 50% of the students participating in the program the very first year. The next year, they had as many as, we had 890 students join us from Urbana Sugarloaf. Last year, there were over 12,000 students involved in the Lunch Out of Landfill programs in the 14 schools that I had mentioned. What we see here is not just a program that is a one-day tree planting, but this is a program that involves every student in every school every day. There are amazing curricular ties that come into this, that apply to this. And I want to share just a few of these curricular ties as we talk about some of the partners that I work with. Let's see, where's my slide? Lunch Out of Landfills is, as I had mentioned, it's one of many programs. There are other programs like this, but not too many of these programs have actually taken the time to collect the data to make these compelling arguments. We have a toolkit along with ESRAG, and we've compiled a toolkit where a lot of the work has been done. Inside that toolkit, we have the videos that students have made. There are links to great resources that are available, and even a template on how to collect data. We also partner with PTAs, and we try to focus on teaching parents not only to understand that a lot of the lunches a lot of the material in the lunch they provide kids are actually thrown out, and we also want to try to encourage them to use reusable lunch containers. Some of the partners that I'd like to point out to you that are mentioned in the toolkit are, one, if your community doesn't have a commercial compost facility, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has not only trainings for community composting and where individuals can compost, but they also have a certification process where you can become a commercially approved composter. So if you don't have that facility, ILSR is a great resource. EcoSafe is a company that manufactures compostable bags, which help us to move the material cleanly. They also have a complete line of compostable products. And they also have engaged in proving that a waste diversion program, when you divert waste by 87%, you're reducing costs by the same manner. And they've also incorporated fundraising programs that students can use to mitigate the cost of diverting waste. I also want to mention the World Wildlife Federation Fund has a Food Waste Warriors, an excellent resource for educating kids. They have students that have videos of how they minimize the amount of food waste that their parents purchase, what they consume, what they throw away. And I also want to mention kisstheground.com, which is run by Phinney Makepeace. There are amazing instructional videos as to why we need to do this. It talks about the benefits of composting, the origins of how the earth was formed and how we need to build soils. The last company I'd like to mention is TerraCycle. I know at least in the United States, there are a lot of compostable items. There are a lot of items that are thrown away that are not recyclable. For instance, juice pouches, chip bags, snack wrappers, those types of things. You could have a fundraising program through TerraCycle. If you engage TerraCycle programming, an effective, clean compost program, a clean recycle program to the extent we can recycle material, we can reduce waste by 90 to 95%. It's a possibility that we have within the schools to teach them, to guide them, and to inspire them. And that's where the true benefit can really arise. I'd like to finish with the Rotary four-way test. Of the things we think, say, or do, first, is it the truth? The results of our work in Lunch Out of Landfills is irrefutable. There is enormous amounts of food waste that we're we're throwing away materials that need to be, especially with this pandemic, cycled back to communities that absolutely need them. The second is it fair to all concerned? And everyone who's involved in the climate crisis, whether it's economically distressed communities, affluent communities, will benefit from instructing children to engage in these programs. Will it build goodwill and better friendships? When I first joined Rotary, I joined the club, worked on local projects, was really inspired how we helped our individual communities. But when I became Rotary president, I began to interact with other Rotary clubs within the Frederick area. I began to partner with their issues and their projects, and they helped me with mine. When I joined ESRAG, I became part of a world community, a global community, where I'm interacting with people from every part of the globe. The climate crisis is a global crisis. It's going to take global solutions. And ESRAG, among other organizations that interact collectively, will solve the problem. The last of the four-way tests is, will it be beneficial to all concerned? My statement there is it's emphatic, but I would almost take the luxury of changing, will it be beneficial to all concerned, to it will be beneficial to all concerned. Drawdown will be following me, and we understand through Drawdown that we've got 10 years to make substantial changes in our behaviors. One side of landfill addresses food waste, it addresses composting. But once you direct a child to one solution, they begin to think more globally of others. I'd like to finish with one other video if I can access it. It's a young girl this young girl is a 3-year-old who lives in Bahrain, and I'm going to share her commentary, and that probably speaks much louder than I could.
Bins, what do you put in them?
So first you get compost, which is the compost bin. Then we have.
What do you put in it though?
And then trash. Well, we put plastic inside the plastic one, and then garbage inside the garbage one, then food inside the food one, and then paper inside the paper one.
Lucy, that's excellent.
With that, I will end. This is not a difficult problem. It can be handled by a 3-year-old. It must be led by Rotarians and engage the world. If Lucy can understand this, all of us can. And thank you for time. We may not have had time for questions, but I'll turn this over to you, Christopher.
Right, and so the thing that I saw come through on the chat, what a brilliant idea it is to have school children and students work. And so there's a shout out to you for leading the way on this. So I'm handing this over to Karen, who's going to do the introduction to Jonathan and Drawdown.
Thank you so very much, Chris, and thank you, Joe, for your words. Joe has begun to coordinate and bring the youth in the schools and work with a group called Climate Solutions Coalition. The enterprising exchange student from France buttonholed an RI president and said, I think the climate change rounded up 600 people on social media, all beneficiaries of the Rotary Youth programs, and ended up with us. And the result is the Climate Solutions Coalition. You can access it through our webpage. And that brings us to our next speaker, who is a here, Jonathan Foley. Many of us are devotees of Project Drawdown, especially when I had the honor of talking to the Environmental Issues Task Force in Evanston about the need for an area of focus for the environment. And one of the trustees and directors can, well, what kind of projects would we do that we're not doing now? And I ordered each member of the panel a copy, and the staff wanted to get ahead of me. And I said, no, don't pass them out before I start to talk and listen to me. So it's in the hands of the highest level of Rotary leaders, and we at ESRAG are working diligently through an initiative we started, and I keep getting calls from Rotarians. Can we organize this? all these individual Rotarians want to give presentations at their meetings. So as we introduce Jonathan, ESRAG has already begun down the path. Not only do we have the Project Drawdown initiative, you want to send an email to madelinegallen@gmail.com. People are on calculating the footprint of individual Rotary meetings and Rotary travel. We've created an offset fund. We have a group that's working on greening events, Rotarians for Bees who are supporting pollinator, which has to do with food security around the group, working on food waste, many planting endeavors to sequester carbon. The marching orders for all the Rotary clubs in India is my incredible goal, the executive director of Project Drawdown. He is a world-renowned environmental scientist, sustainability expert, author, and publisher. His work is focused on understanding our changing planet to sustain the climate, ecosystems, we all depend on. His groundbreaking research and insights have led Jonathan to become a trusted advisor to governments, foundations, non-governmental contributors to security and the climate change and the sustainability of the world's resources. He has published over 130 peer-reviewed scientific, including many highly cited works in Science, Nature, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was 15 years at the University of Wisconsin, where he founded the Center for Sustainability and Global Environment and served as the first Gaylord Nelson Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies. He's a friend of Dr. Jonathan Patz, who's long been a friend of ESRAG. He spent 6 years as the founding director of the Institute of Environment at the University of Minnesota, and has most recently served as the executive director of the California Academy of Sciences. The greenest and most, I'm going to introduce the amazing catalog of solutions, and I hope he'll spend some time explaining why refrigerants management is #1 and what Rotarians can do about Freon. Jonathan is highly in demand as a speaker. It is an honor and privilege to welcome Jonathan as ESRAG and Project Drawdown launch a really amazing partnership. Over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Karen. It's very, very nice to be with you all today, virtually, I guess all over the world, which is fantastic. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm really excited that Project Drawdown and Rotary are forming a new partnership together. We're very, very excited about this, and we're already working to develop some resources that we hope to share with you soon that will hopefully help spread the word around climate solutions a little bit as you do your work. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who's helping to organize this, and we're very, very excited about it. So I was asked to give a short presentation about climate solutions and kind of a drawdown framework, and then just have some conversation and questions. So let me go ahead and share a few slides, and we'll go from there and see if we can make everything work with the technology. We're all becoming experts on Zoom these days. So here we go. All right, so I'm going to talk about the framework we use called Drawdown, and later I'll tell you why we use that word and what it means exactly. But it's really focusing on climate solutions, because we've spent so much time talking about the problems of climate change. It's really now time to roll up our sleeves and focus on solutions. What can we do about this? But before we do, address any sort of new big challenges and look at solutions, we do have to understand how we got here, and this will help inform, what the problem is and therefore what the solutions are. But one of the things we have to recognize is that a lot of these problems we see are happening now globally because just the human footprint has exploded in the last few decades. We're living in an incredibly unusual time of human history. Just in the last few decades, for example, we've seen a massive explosion of the human footprint, both through population, urbanization, and especially the economy. And during the last 50 years, for example, we've seen the population of the world more or less double, but the economy grew almost 5 to 6-fold during the same time. So in just 50 years, we've had a kind of doubling of people, but about a 6-fold increase in our economic activity. We now consume 3 times more food, about twice as much water, and about 3 times more fossil fuels than we did only 50 years ago. And just to put that in perspective, we've changed more, not only in the last 50 years than any other time in history, we've changed more in the last 50 years than all human history combined. And so that's why at this particular time in history, we're seeing not only local environmental issues, which have been with us for thousands of years, we're now seeing disruptions of entire planetary systems, things we really critically depend on a global scale. Climate change isn't the only issue, but it's probably the most important. But we should also recognize the losses of things like biodiversity and rainforest and fresh water and the health of our oceans and everything else. But climate change is really central to the environment and to everything else we do because it's so connected to everything. As we begin to disrupt our climate, we're seeing changes in weather patterns, where water is, where we grow our food, our health, our security, our economy, everything is connected to climate. So if we don't really solve the climate crisis, it's going to be so much harder for humanity to thrive later in this century, or even today. So we really do have to focus a lot on the climate challenge. Now, I know you know all this stuff, and I'm not going to bother you too much with the problem side, but just to get us on the same page, since about the early to mid 19th century, we've been increasing greenhouse gas levels, including carbon dioxide, but others, fluorinated gases, nitrous oxide, methane. These are all human contributed gases that are adding to what the atmosphere already was doing, which is protecting us from outer space, keeping this planet more habitable and a little bit warmer than it might have been otherwise. But we humans are thickening that blanket of the atmosphere and trapping heat. This is the increase of CO2 levels since the mid-19th century. And we've known that when we increase levels of CO2 and these other gases, we warm the planet. This is absolutely not up for debate, by the way. And we've known the physics of this since the 19th century. In fact, I started this graph around the 1850s on purpose because the first scientist who ever really hypothesized that CO2 increases would warm the planet actually wrote her first paper on this in the 1850s. And until a couple of years ago, most people never even knew her name. An American woman named Eunice Foote, F-O-O-T-E, was the first scientist to publish any paper showing that CO2 would warm the planet. She was never given credit for that work. It was actually given instead to an English male scientist named Tyndall, who published his work actually 4 years later. But Eunice Foote was actually the path-breaking leader who did discover this, and we've known it for over 170 years now. So this is not new science. We've been around a long time here. But as the CO2 levels have been increasing, so have temperatures around the world. We're seeing just the beginning of this right now, but so far the planet has warmed about 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is when you talk about the temperature of an entire planet. Between now and the last ice age was about 2.5, 3 degrees colder than normal. We've already warmed the planet 1 degree warmer than normal in the other direction into something we've never seen in geologic history when our species has been on this planet. So it's very, very dangerous, very disruptive. I mean, you've heard countless talks about this, so I won't really worry about that. The one thing I do want to start off though with saying too is that this is absolutely not hopeless. A lot of people kind of see climate change as this, either they dismiss it and pretend it's not real, or they get into complete despair and think that it's inevitable and we're all going to be living in a totally destroyed world. That's not true because we get to still build the future we want. There are still options to prevent further climate change. We get to make some choices. The window of opportunity to do this is shrinking, but we do have some choices ahead where we can change our future and actually avert the worst of future climate change if we start to act now. And that's what we do at Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is a nonprofit. We're a scientific and kind of communications NGO that focuses only on one thing, being a independent, science-based, kind of nonpartisan, non-commercial think tank focusing on sharing climate solutions with the world. So what we do is we review and assess what we can do about climate change. We study it independently without any financial or political interest, and then share that as widely as possible. And we use the name Drawdown very, very specifically to mean something in particular. Again, here's like a graph showing the levels of greenhouse gases going up in the atmosphere up to about the present day. These levels, by the way, are the highest they've been in probably about 3 to 5 million years. So this is a really unusual kind of thing we're seeing today. If we keep going on the path we're on right now, greenhouse gases will just continue to increase, causing further warming and disruption of our planet. And we don't want that. And so what Drawdown's all about is kind of like we're hearing a lot of these days, it's about bending the curve. Not on a pandemic, but on a different change of our planet. It's bending the curve on the future of our atmosphere. There's one path that leads to more warming and more disruption and more destruction, And we don't have to choose a path. We can choose another one where we work to kind of bend down greenhouse gas levels and restore them back to a more natural state, or at least a less dangerous one. And the moment that we hit that kind of point where greenhouse gases start to decrease again, that is what we call the moment of drawdown. And so that's what we use that name for. Drawdown doesn't mean sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. It means the point in time where the greenhouse gas levels stabilize and then start to come down again, thereby halting climate change. And our mission, and we're really excited to work with you at the Rotary, is to help the world achieve that as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. So how do we do that? How do we actually pull the curve down again? Well, to do that, you have to kind of think about the atmosphere as a system. The atmosphere is a system with things going into it and coming out of it. And it's a little bit helpful to just kind of know the basics of this. So if you imagine the atmosphere as like a giant box in the sky, imagine it like a bathtub that's you can fill up or you can drain down again with the level of water representing kind of greenhouse gas levels, let's say. The atmosphere is filling up with greenhouse gases from these sources. These are the things that humans do that release greenhouse gases. And these numbers represent the breakdown of what we do that contributes to climate change on a global scale. Every country, every state, every city has a different mix, but when you add it up to the globe, about 25% of climate change comes from electricity. Then we have food. We heard a lot about food waste, which is so important. Industry and refrigerants show up in there, transportation, buildings, and other things. These are the places where greenhouse gases are born and go into the atmosphere, and that's where they kind of come from. These are the sources of greenhouse gases. But there's another part of the atmosphere that's kind of interesting, is it's the part that nature plays. It turns out that our oceans and our forests absorb about 40% of the greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere every year. Nature just takes 40% of that off the top and removes it almost immediately, leaving behind roughly 59 or 60% of the greenhouse gas pollution we put in each year. And that accumulates year upon year, building up over centuries and accumulating, warming the planet. So this is kind of the problem. This is actually probably the most important graph you'll ever see when it comes to climate solutions, because it shows you everything we can do. On the left is where we humans are emitting pollution. On the right is where nature is helping to remove some of that pollution, and maybe we can help that along. So to achieve drawdown, here's what we have to do. Here's the picture today. We put more pollution in the sky than nature can absorb, so it's building up and greenhouse gas levels are accumulating in the atmosphere, getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year. But if we want to change this, we can do a couple of things. One is we can start to bring these sources, this pollution, down to zero. Let's cut out this pollution. Let's stop burning fossil fuels. Let's stop tearing down rainforests and so on. And if those sources start to go to zero in the next few decades, that's most of the answer. That's a really, really important part of this. At the same time, we can also work with nature and maybe even our own engineering kind of prowess and figure out ways to maintain and maybe even add to what we call sinks of greenhouse gases, things that pull carbon dioxide and other gases out of the atmosphere, preventing them from causing climate change. So by reducing the sources and helping nature's sinks, we start to bend the curve and greenhouse gases come back down. So that's kind of the basics. If you want to solve climate change, you got to do those two things. You got to bring the pollution down to zero and you got to work with nature. And those are the two big levers. I'll talk about a third a little bit later because it's also very interesting. But the solutions that we draw down and look at come in these two big buckets primarily. First principle, again, let's stop polluting. You know, again, like in your bathtub, if your bathtub's overflowing onto your, bathroom and destroying your apartment or whatever, first thing you do is you turn down the faucet. And that's what we're doing here, is we want to bring those emissions to zero. So to do that, again, we have to know where the problem comes from. Greenhouse gases come from about 5 major areas of human activity. Globally, on average, 25% of our pollution comes from making electricity. That's burning coal and natural gas primarily in order to make electricity. Of course, if we make electricity in a different way or we use less electricity, this can go away. We'll talk about that in a second. Surprisingly to many people, the food system is almost tied with electricity as the second biggest contributor to climate change. I'll talk about that in a minute, but we already know that food waste will be part of the answer, but also changing our diets and changing the way we farm will be a big part of that as well. Industry is responsible for about 20% of our emissions. There's going to be lot of different things we can do there that's really crucial. And we have transportation, of course, our cars and trucks and planes and boats and all the rest. We also have buildings, and this is now 90% of all of our emissions come in these 5 areas. These are the emissions that come directly from buildings, in addition to the electricity they might use and other things. These are emissions from things like furnaces and hot water heaters and so on. And then we have everything else, which I just put into this other category. But just think of this, nice thing to remember that in 5 categories, you get 90% of climate change sources: electricity, food, industry, transportation, and buildings. We can work on 5 things. So we're gonna go walk through these very quickly and show you how Drawdown thinks about these solutions. Again, electricity is about 25% of the problem. So producing electricity in different ways where we don't burn coal or gas will be part of the solution, but also we can think about how electricity is used. Where do we use it? And maybe we could be more efficient about it. And if we look at the use of electricity, we see that buildings and industrial processes are probably the biggest levers for how we can reduce our demands for electricity through efficiency. So at Drawdown, we've looked at all hundreds of different solutions, really, but we publish about 80 of them every year. And in fact, we just launched a new book this year called the Drawdown Review, which is free on our website. I hope you take a look at it. But here are some solutions that focus on energy efficiency in the electricity sector, things like better building components, more efficient buildings, and so on. That's always the first place to start, is let's use less of the stuff we're making. So let's just be more efficient with electricity. Lots of opportunities there. But then let's make the electricity we do need more in a more climate-friendly way with renewables or non-carbon emitting technologies. And we do that. This is the cluster of all the solutions we've analyzed in just the electricity area. And the circles represent the size of the solution. The bigger the circle, the bigger the solution. Some of them have 2 circles, which represents kind of a range of estimates we have for the size of that solution moving forward. But here we see a whole bunch of them are in energy efficiency and in things like wind, solar, and so on the renewable side of things. So again, efficiency and shifting the way we do things is crucial in electricity. Same thing's going to be true for food, it turns out, as well. And in the food sector, again, about 1/4 of climate change comes from this. And most of the food emissions actually come from 3 big areas. Deforestation, that is clearing things like tropical rainforest in like the Amazon or Indonesia, places like this, for more agricultural land, usually for cattle or oil palm or soybeans, which are primarily used as animal feed. So animal agriculture drives a lot of that, but not all of it. The second biggest area is methane, which comes mainly from animals, mostly cattle, but also sheep and other ruminant animals that digest their food in a way that makes them burp methane. But also a little bit from rice fields too, which also can release some methane, but most of this comes from cattle. Interestingly, most people aren't always aware of this. The methane that comes out of a cow or from cattle comes out of the front end of the animal, not the back end of the animal, because they're burping methane that comes out of the chambers of their stomach where the rumen are, and that methane is released out the front end. The third biggest source of greenhouse gases from the food system actually comes from using too much fertilizer. When we use too much fertilizers or manures on a farm field, they can combine with water and air and sometimes form something called nitrous oxide, which is an additional kind of greenhouse gas that warms the planet. Everything else is the rest, but the biggest things are burning down forests for more food, too many animals, and too much fertilizer. So when we think about how to reduce emissions in agriculture, we can think about how we farm, but as you heard from the previous speaker, also how we use food is a really big deal. And that's why it turns out food waste reduction, as well as changing our diets a little bit, especially in rich countries where we're eating too much red meat for our own health, but also for the planet. Kind of changing what we eat on the left-hand side, plus how do we grow what we eat on the right-hand side, gives us a lot of solutions here. But food waste is one of my favorites because it's something we can all engage in several times a day at home, in our businesses, our schools, our communities, and so on. And it's something I think that can help be very tangible and show people where solutions can be. We also have a lot of emissions coming from industry. I won't go through this in much detail, but refrigerants show up here, as was mentioned before, but also other things like how we make steel. Turns out cement is a major emitter of greenhouse gases, not just the energy used to make it, but when cement is curing, it releases CO2 to the atmosphere. Also making plastics and so on releases a little bit, as well as managing all the waste in the world. So we see a lot of solutions here, but the biggest ones we find are around refrigerants. These are things like hydrofluorocarbons, which are kind of newer chemicals used in refrigerants that replaced the so-called chlorofluorocarbons of the 1970s, because we knew those would destroy the ozone layer as well as contribute to climate change. We replaced them with ozone-friendly chemicals, but didn't realize they were also going to contribute to climate change. So now we have to kind of change refrigerants yet again, preventing them from leaking, but also maybe changing the chemicals themselves, just something less harmful. We can get into transportation as well. Moving things around emits about 14% of global greenhouse gases. Most of that is on road transportation, cars and trucks. A little bit by flying, about 1.8% of our emissions come from flying, which gets a lot of attention because actually very few people in the world fly. Most of the flying is done by a small number of people. So that for some individuals, that's our biggest contribution to climate change, and we need to work on that too. But again, just like in food and in electricity, looking at efficiency and then shifting to an alternative way of doing things is really what we need here. So even if we're still using gas and diesel fuel, let's be more efficient about it with smaller vehicles, more efficient vehicles, and so on, as we shift to electrification, mass transit, and other things. Buildings are the biggest remaining sector. This is the building emissions directly from the building, not from the electricity they use and things like this. And buildings are about 6% of global emissions. Most of that are residential buildings, about 2 to 1. It's residential buildings, homes and apartments, to commercial and public buildings. And again, things like efficiency and shifting energy sources are crucial here. So I know there's a lot of material, and if you want to learn more about it, just go to our website and you can read more. But I just wanted to show you that reducing sources is always this kind of 1-2 punch of let's be more efficient with the stuff we are using. And then second, let's change the way we make it anyway to something that's low carbon emitting or zero carbon. Now, the second principle I mentioned was kind of supporting the sinks of greenhouse gases. Remember, 40% of the greenhouse gases we put in the air are sucked out immediately. But that's only going to be true as long as nature is healthy, because a lot of those sinks happen on land in forest. And they won't do that if we tear down our forest or our forest burn down from climate change and other things. So there are a lot of solutions to maintaining these sinks in the forest of the world by kind of helping to protect and restore those ecosystems. But also we can put into play maybe additional land that currently doesn't absorb carbon, but maybe our world's farmlands. And so by shifting the way we farm, maybe we could build up carbon in the soils of our kind of croplands and pastures of the world by managing them differently. And there are lots of different ways, some of which are called kind of regenerative agriculture or agroforestry and so on. These are ways we can put not only forests to work, but maybe some of our farmland as well. That's pretty exciting. There are other ways too that we can help as humans kind of maintain the health of our oceans and maybe enhance the carbon sinks that are existing in the oceans today. Especially protecting our coastal wetlands and mangroves would be really important. And then finally, someday we'll be able to build machines that can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. There are some prototypes today. None of them are really at scale, but they're very, very interesting ideas where we might be able to build machines that can literally suck greenhouse gases out of the air, keeping them from causing climate change. That's a long ways away. In the meantime, nature's doing a good job of this. The last area I just want to mention is not really on that original chart. I talked about reducing pollution and helping nature. But then the third area is things we're going to do anyway to improve society because they're the right thing to do. They're around human rights, about increasing equity and opportunity for the world. And when we do that, sometimes we find that also helps reduce the problem of climate change. In particular, in our early work, we noticed a lot of possibility for increasing the effort to help girls and young women around the world have more opportunity and access to education and healthcare. When that happens, girls will typically have much more economic opportunity and many more opportunities than their mothers and grandmothers had. And they often will have healthier children, maybe fewer children as a result, and maybe later in life. And that begins to bend the curve on kind of population growth, but in a way that's encouraging people and helping lift people up, not controlling anybody. And if that happens along with increased economic growth in different parts of the world, this could bend the curve on emissions out in the coming decades in a way that's actually good for people. So let me just put it together and I'll wrap up here and we can maybe have a few minutes for questions. But when we think about these solutions, I really like to think about them again in these three big buckets of let's reduce the pollution. And I showed you 5 big areas where we could do that in electricity and food and industry, transportation and buildings. And those circles represent kind of clusters of solutions that we have, within each which there might be dozens of different things we can do. We can work with nature and our own innovation to support carbon sinks, especially in forest on land, but also some in the oceans and maybe with machines in the future. And also when we kind of work, especially with health and education access, but also protecting the rights of indigenous communities, improving equity and opportunity for all, we find that many of these things also contribute to climate solutions. This is why we're finding so much that climate change isn't really a separate issue from human rights. They overlap in beneficial ways so much if we think about them the right way. The good news is that Drawdown shows that we already have enough solutions to do the job today. We can stop climate change with everything we need right here, right now, available at our fingertips. That's kind of amazing. What we don't have isn't that we don't need more technology, although it could help. I'd be very happy to have some more tools added to the toolbox in the future. But what we can't afford to waste is time. What is so important is, now is much more important than new. Sure, we could wait for Elon Musk to invent something new or whatever, but in the meantime, we have to get busy now, because we've wasted about 30 to 40 years where the scientists have been shouting at the government and others to get off the stick and do something, and very little has happened. So now we are in a race to kind of stop climate change, and anything we can do to start now is crucial. So this is not only an incredible challenge, this is really an incredible opportunity to rethink the way we do things around the world and change the way we manage our energy systems, our food, our agriculture, our cities, and so on. And I think we can do it in ways that actually could increase our quality of life and economic opportunities for all. And so this is not just a way of solving a problem, it's actually an incredible opportunity. And the last thing I want to leave you with is, this will be, we at Drawdown have shown kind of the science and engineering and economics of climate solutions. And we've, tried to document them and share them with others who can then put them into practice around the world. But one of the things we are so needing today is a bolder and more compassionate kind of leadership. We need to show people, I think, a different kind of leadership that paints a picture of the future that shows what we can actually do if we pull together and try to build a better world together. Unfortunately, today, especially now, we seem to have political leaders and media pundits who are very interested in dividing us, but for their own benefit, not for ours. And that's just sick. We can't survive like that. We're going to need leadership that pulls us together and shows us a vision of a world we can create together, something better that we can all rally around. Martin Luther King, for example, didn't walk around America saying that he had a nightmare. He talked about a dream that he had, a dream where everyone was invited to participate and try to build a better world. Sadly, we're seeing today that that world is not yet here, but we are making some progress and have a lot of work to do. But I think the same is true with climate change, that we can do so much if we work together, we learn, and we also share with each other a vision of a better world, but also tools for getting there. And so I'll leave you with that, I guess, and stop here and invite you to come to our website, drawdown.org, and follow us on social media, Project Drawdown. And we're very happy to have lots of resources there, including an entirely new free book, which I'll show you here, called the Drawdown Review. We stopped putting our books on Amazon and other places. They're now just free as a downloadable PDF. And so I encourage you to do that, but also lots and lots of additional information, both on the web and on social media. So let me stop there, and I hope we have a little bit of time for some questions. I know we're running a tad late, but I hope we have a moment to do that if we would like, but I'll turn it back to Karen to help moderate that.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your amazing presentation. Lots of questions. I think this one gets to the heart of it. If you were a member of a Rotary Club, where would you start with your list of projects?
Well, it depends where I was, because in different parts of the world, we have, even in my country, in the United States, for example, you live in Madison, Wisconsin, I live in San Francisco, for example. We have very different kind of aspects of climate change, even within the different states of the US, for example, let alone in Australia and Europe and other places you have so many other members. So I'd want to know kind of what are the biggest contributors to climate change for your region would be. Where I live in San Francisco, it turns out about 45% of the emissions of greenhouse gases in California come from transportation, because we've already done a really good job on electricity here. We've got more to do, but electricity is only about 14% of California's emissions, but cars and trucks are 45%. So that's the biggest issue here. So I would think as a Rotarian, if I were in the Bay Area, I would try to think about like a local solution like, too many people have to drive too far to get to work because housing's really unaffordable around here. That's why there's so much bloody emissions from cars. What can Rotary do to help that? Can we work with the business community and others to help, telecommuting, which is a drawdown solution? We're getting good at that during the coronavirus. But how do we help people with alternative transportation, carpooling, mass transit, things like this? That can also, and things that would help your community as well. I don't like to see things that are only a climate solution. If we can find things that are a climate solution and the solution for your economy, for equity, for justice, other things that matter, and there's so much alignment there. How can we help people live in a more vibrant community and contribute to climate change at the same time? You'd have to look city by city to know which you really want to do where you are. But usually start with like, what's our biggest contribution to climate change and how can we work on that? Or just pick something, like food waste is pretty ubiquitous and everybody can work on that. Or shifting diets a little bit, things like this, things that are kind of a universal solution that work everywhere. So anyway, that's a lot more discussion to have in that future.
Okay, I have a couple more questions we're going to try and squeeze in.
Okay.
I liked your reference to co-benefits. The next question is, what about the military's impact on our carbon footprint, not just during wartime, but the background noise of man and machine maintenance?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Again, I have a kind of a US bias, and I know you're largely international group, but the Pentagon is the largest purchasing agents, in the United States. Like they buy more stuff than any other organization, including energy resources and fossil fuels. The trick here, I think, is they're not a really huge emitter. The world's militaries are still less than about 1% of global emissions, but it matters. But what's really exciting is when you can find solutions that help improve the safety and health and security of armed forces. For example, during the Obama administration, they were noticing that our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, when they were being attacked with roadside bombs, is mostly caravans that were carrying things like diesel fuel and water. But there's like a lot of trucks going back and forth transporting fuel. What if they didn't have to do that? What if all the encampments were powered with solar panels instead of diesel generators? What if they had more modern battery packs, solar, micro wind turbines, things like this, or fuel cells, things that didn't require so much diesel fuel? You could, you'd probably save lives of our soldiers, which would be, really a great reason to do it, but also reduce emissions. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to, again, find win-win solutions, and that's so much more persuasive. I'm not sure that the world's militaries are full of lots of tree huggers and greenies, but when you talk about saving lives and saving, improving security of civilians, but also military forces, this is a good thing. So again, let's find a win-win solutions that are good for everybody involved. And the good news is they're there in abundance. Every time we look, we always find them.
And the last question, we know that the current drop in emissions because of sheltering in place and COVID is fleeting. But do you see an opportunity for us to change the game, change the conversation? Because
well, absolutely. A lot of people ask about that. I mean, first of all, I want to say, addressing climate change should, absolutely should not be something that causes human death and suffering. So, no environmentalist at all should be celebrating coronavirus and saying, oh, this is good for nature. It's terrible. People are dying. This is a human tragedy. So there's nothing to celebrate here at all. With that said, though, what's more important is the economy will build back after this big disruption. I mean, we're talking about a pandemic and an economic disruption, the likes of which no one alive has ever seen before. So this is pretty unprecedented time, and a real question marks about what kind of world are we going to build after this? Is it going back to all the bad old ways of doing things, or are we going to be smarter after this? And can we do things that preserve not only our economic opportunities, but also our health, our security, and our future? So, for example, one of the fascinating things about a virus like the coronavirus is these are emerging diseases that came from either wildlife or from agricultural animal systems. Each virus is different. But in the last 50 years or so, we've seen this explosion of new viruses jumping into the human population, which we have no immunity for. HIV, SARS, MERS, monkeypox, Ebola, now coronavirus. We're going to have more of these things, but one of the things that can help keep the viruses in check, but also help reduce the problem of climate change, is stopping deforestation, or to do agriculture in more sustainable ways where not so many animals are being produced in such close quarters where a virus can jump into the human population right next door. We really have a lot of work to do to look at how we can improve human health, but also kind of planetary health at the same time. And I think there are a lot of good solutions involving our diets, agriculture, but also stopping the encroachment into the world's ecosystems, especially rainforest and places like that. So we'll see what happens. After the last big recession in 2007 and 8, the United States actually had hit our peak emissions of greenhouse gases in the US in 2007, and they've been going down every year ever since, even though the economy has rebounded a lot until this year. Most people don't know that, but the US is actually 15% below in 2019, was 15% below our peak emissions, which happened in 2007. Because the economy that came back after the Great Recession in the United States anyway was very different than the one before. It was less manufacturing, less heavy industry. It was more efficient with its use of energy and drifted into more technological kinds of things. If this happens again, some major shift in the economy, maybe there are opportunities to reduce emissions and have them stay that way, but in a way that doesn't cause human suffering and death, which is not a way to solve climate change ever.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. I will keep my thanks short to get us on track. I think besides applause, the best way we can thank Jonathan is to make that partnership with Project Drawdown the best idea they ever had.
Well, I look forward to working with you all on that. And please, looking forward to that partnership. And it's great that we'll be working together to help spread solutions, not just problems around the world. And goodness knows the world needs that. So I want to thank you all at Rotary for your incredible service to the communities you live in and for what you do around the world. It's really very inspiring. So thank you so much for all that.
Thanks. And now, thank you, Jonathan. And on to Pat Armstrong, who is the anchor runner in this relay race from her home country of Australia. You're on, Pat, and I'm going to mute.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Karen. We've now heard 3 wonderful presentations on 3 quite different environmental topics. Our next presenter is Brendan Foran, who is the CEO of Greening Australia, and he will speak on environmental restoration from the Australian perspective, but with many lessons for Rotarians in other parts of the globe. But before I introduce Brendan, I've been asked to give a little bit more background to ESRAG. Now, ESRAG is a relatively new Rotary Action Group, but it's growing rapidly and currently has over 620 members worldwide. And while ESRAG members are working on many international and local environmental projects, we've also set up 12 dynamic regional chapters in different parts of the world to give members opportunities to network with people in their own region and to plan more locally based projects. And I'm currently the chair of the ESRAG regional chapter in the Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Islands region, which we have abbreviated as ANSPI. Although we're still in the early stages of building the chapter and planning our way forward, we're already involved in a number of exciting projects concerning plastics in the oceans, Rotarians for Bees, and I'll tell you more about that later on, and tree planting. So I was going to give you some more detail about what we're doing in Down Under, but I think I might skip over that for our timing issues today. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker, as I said before, Brendan Foran. And I first met Brendan 3 years ago when he was a keynote speaker at a district conference in the historic city of Bendigo in Victoria, Australia. And ironically, Bendigo was at the heart of the great Victorian gold rush in the second half of this 19th century, during which 1.4 million tonnes of gold was extracted from Victoria alone, bringing enormous wealth to our country, but accompanied by widespread damage to the natural environment and to what Fred Kahir calls the Aboriginal cultural landscape. Brendan will touch on these and other impacts on the Australian environment today. So about Brendan, since joining Greening Australia as CEO in 2011, Brendan has led an organisation-wide governance and strategy reform program that has led to greater levels of impact, efficiency and resilience. Before joining Greening Australia, Brendan was the Corporate Affairs Manager Eastern States for Alcoa of Australia. He holds an MBA and an advanced diploma in business management from the University of Ballarat. He has extensive experience in business management and strategy development with strengths in government relations and liaison, community and stakeholder relations, and organisational transformation. He was a 2011 Rotary Foundation Group Study Exchange participant in Iceland and a 2016 Harvard Club of Australia non-profit fellow. Brendan will speak to us today about some of the factors impacting on Australia's natural environment, the current state of the Australian environment, and the work of Greening Australia to help restore the environment of our very beautiful country. Brendan, thank you for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Pat. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so fantastic to be here today. Happy World Environment Day to you all, and recognising that people are joining this presentation from a long way around the world. While this has a very specific Australian flavour, one of the things I'll attempt to do is try and bring it up to an international level as much as I can. Noting very importantly that we're a practical on-ground organisation. So while we operate to a set of global strategies, I will regularly bring it down to what's actually happening on the ground or in the Australian landscape. So I always start with this slide here. We believe people thrive when nature thrives, which in many ways is Greening Australia's equivalent of the four-way test. We think about our vision and our mission, and we believe we're both a people and nature organisation, and we also believe, and interesting on the back of some of Jonathan's commentary there before and some of the questions from the people on the Zoom call, is we believe that the economies, communities and environment are all connected in ways that benefit them all. So as I said, I always start with this slide, mainly because this is the most important relationship in our organisation. It is the on-ground officer, the person that's doing the work in the field, so our production line, and the landholder that they're working with. That landholder could be Indigenous, as you're seeing in this picture here. They could be a farmer, they could be a national park, etc. But it doesn't matter how good the plans and the strategies that the CEO and the chair of an organisation may come up with. If the magic's not happening on the ground at a relationship level between the field officer and the landholder, then the plans are not going to come to fruition. So we always start with that. The other thing that we always start with, which I'm just about to take you through, is an acknowledgement of country. So Pat just spoke about the Aboriginal landscape, and we've just finished a week here in Australia called Reconciliation Week, which talks about the progress that we're on around reconciling and inclusion with our Indigenous owners, the Aboriginal people. And I think with what we're seeing happening around the world at the moment, this is relevant not just in Australia, but globally. So we talk about acknowledging the traditional owners and paying our respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. And just to put a local flavour on that, like many of you, I've been working from home for the past 3 months, which is interesting, an interesting way to run a national organisation. But I'm about 50 metres from the Murray River, so the people in Australia would know where I'm talking about, which is the largest, longest water source in Australia, a very dry landscape. And I live on a man-made lake that was actually created to create irrigation and bring agriculture into the region. So it's on the border between Victoria and New South Wales, and it's Yorta country. So the original owners of this landscape are Yorta people. And in paying my respects to them, I also pay my respects to the elders of your particular landscape. So briefly getting through a couple of slides here, Greening Australia is a national organisation with global ambition, and we've been around since 1982, and we were established by government, and we believe that our reason to be, along with our vision of healthy and productive landscapes where people and nature thrive, is solving great environmental challenges, demonstrating proof of impact, and producing inspirational stories. And so while the great environmental challenges of every generation may change, we believe for this generation it is taking direct action on climate change, reversing the decline of threatened species, supporting traditional owners and their aspirations for restoring country, creating sustainable cities for people and wildlife, supporting regenerative agriculture and forestry systems, and saving, not just preserving, saving the Great Barrier Reef, which is in decline. So I'm going to step you through those in a little bit now, so I'll keep moving rather than pause there. As I mentioned there in my earlier comments, while we are a very local and direct action-based organisation in the Australian context, the way that we put together our strategies is that we work out what those great environmental challenges are, and then we look at the research, science and impact-focused based strategies which exist at a regional, national and international level. So the ones, I've tried to pick up the ones that people on this call would be most familiar with, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which I believe are a very great improvement on the Millennium Goals. They were a good start, but I think the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a great improvement. And consistent with my comments there before about the economy, the community and the environment being connected in ways that benefit them all as we pursue our vision of healthy and productive landscapes where vision and nature thrive, we pick off 10 of the Millennium Goals. No poverty, good health and well-being, quality education, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, and all the way through to partnerships for the goals. So while we don't design regional, national and international strategies, the way we design our programs and how we put the investment on the ground to take direct action on global environmental issues is we choose a target that we believe we can achieve ourselves, and then we also set a target that we believe through our partnerships that we can achieve. So the first program, so just flicking back here, Great Southern Landscapes. So this area here in the green, if you follow my mouse on the screen. Australia, for those that are wondering how big Australia is, it's about the same size as the US, but our population is only about 24 million by comparison. So this area in the green here is largely agricultural. The bits in the dots there is Adelaide, Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney and Brisbane. So that's our nature and cities. Tasmania, the little island off an island, speaks for itself. And the area in orange or Mojave red there is the area which we believe is Indigenous land. So that covers the whole landscape. And then the green area is the Great Barrier Reef catchment. So these are the rivers, the estuaries, the wetlands which flow out onto the Great Barrier Reef. So I'll step you through briefly of these different programs now. So since European settlement, which in Australia was in the late 1700s, about 1788, the first fleet of Europeans landed in Australia, about 90 million hectares. 90 million hectares, I'm not sure what that is in acres. We talk about hectares in Australia, so whoever's got a calculator there might want to convert that into acres. But 90 million hectares of land has been cleared for the purposes of agriculture, urban populations, irrigation, etc. So 90 million hectares. And our goal is to reinstate by 2050 10 million hectares of that land, because we believe and we know from our science-based approach that we can achieve that goal of integrated economic, environment and community outcomes by reinstating 10 million hectares of that 90 million hectares and get all the environmental benefits that previously would have come from the 90 million hectares. This is the program that Greening Australia is most well known for, large-scale tree planting activities, and a bit later I'll actually talk about some of the on-ground statistics that we achieve year on year. The Great Barrier Reef. So the two greatest challenges facing the Great Barrier Reef are one, climate change, which I think we all understand, and the second one is water quality. And so climate change basically will create a series of events, bleaching, acidification, ocean warming, etc. That's been very well understood. And a lot of the stuff that Jonathan was speaking about previously, and of course, tree planting in our Great Southern Landscapes program, which actually sequesters carbon out of the atmosphere, helps contribute to the climate change #1 priority. But one of the projects that we've taken on is actually improving water quality flowing out onto the reef. So the way I like to think about this is the Great Barrier Reef is facing the greatest challenge of its life, the greatest health challenge of its life in climate change. Let's say that it's got cancer. And while it's got cancer, it's also dealing with a dose of the flu. And the dose of the flu is the 10 million tonnes of sediment which are flowing out of the Great Barrier Reef catchments, full of nutrient, full of sediment, other pollutants, etc., and flowing onto the Great Barrier Reef each year and pushing that all north. The coastal stream is pushing it all north, and obviously we're in the southern hemisphere, and dropping that sediment all over a reef which is already dealing with warmer temperatures, acidification, and bleaching. So there's 10 million tonnes a year which is coming out. That's a lot of sediment. And what's happened in the Great Barrier Reef catchments is there's been over-clearing. The soils are very, very fine. So once you break the surface, they erode easily. And you also have high rainfall events on the edge of the World Heritage Area. We started working on this program in 2016. So Richard Branson launched it for us, and it's grown into a $40 million program. It's the largest water quality program of its type. And when we started, most people said to us, you can't do it. You can't fix these eroding gullies and these leaking wetlands. And in the first year, we reduced the sediment off one site flowing onto the reef by 97%. Our target was 50 to 80%, and we reduced it by 97%. That exceeded our benchmarks and our thresholds, but we've maintained it for the 5 years since. So this is a solution that can be exported all the way around the world. Despite the perception that Australia is a country where a lot of people live in the bush and by the beach, the reality is, like most other parts of the world, the majority of Australians actually live in cities. And places like Melbourne and Sydney are populations of 5 million and growing regularly and rapidly. So with the majority of Australians living in cities that are expanding, one of the things that we're working on is how you introduce increased amounts of canopy cover, so tree coverage, and biodiversity into urban landscapes. Without going into the deep science behind it, I think it's never been more obvious than the last 3 months as the world's dealt with coronavirus about how much communities value green, open spaces in highly urbanised areas. This program originally was one of the, please excuse the crude description here, I think was the least sexy program we did, you know, talking about tree coverage in cities. Over the last couple of months, my mind has changed completely on this. This is one of the most strategic, value-adding and exciting programs that we do because it has all these interactions with education, older members of the community, multiple stakeholders like water utilities and National Park Service, etc. So this is growing rapidly. And just last week, we announced a $3 million program in Western Sydney with the government of New South Wales. Tasmania, so as I said there before, the island off an island. This is the landscape where we believe we can absolutely prove our vision of healthy, productive landscapes where people and nature thrive. Tasmania's population is about 1 million, so it's relatively small, and it has all this competition for natural resources and the environment. So depending on where you sit, you will describe it as one of the greenest places on the planet, but then other people will say it's one of the most opportune economic landscapes in the world because of its natural values. The balance in Tasmania can easily be met by a compromise between them all. But what's interesting about Tasmania is not only do some of the rarest animals and species in Australia exist there, they are found nowhere else in the world. And so it's got this potential to be an island arc, a showcase for the whole planet of how you can have economies, communities and environments connected in ways that benefit them all. And finally, from a program point of view, Thriving on Country is more a thematic than a program which seeks to deliver large amounts of trees on the ground or reduce water quality impacts on the Great Barrier Reef. This is about a belief system in how we engage with Indigenous Australia and how we represent traditional land management values and how we manage the continent moving forward. What's really interesting and been a very positive outcome of the most recent bushfire situation in Australia is increased recognition that Aboriginals have been managing the landscape for 60,000 years. And managing it not just for food production, but also managing it for increased biodiversity values, but also reducing the ever-present risk in Australia, which people in California and people in South America and Spain and Portugal who may be on this call would understand, that bushfires present to communities. And Aboriginals have been exceptional at managing fire impacts across the landscape for, as I said, for 60,000 years. And very pleasingly, in the last couple of years, I think recognition of their inherent and explicit expertise in this area is now starting to be drawn out. So just very briefly, because these slides and these presentations will be made available to you via Pat at your request, is, you know, we pride ourselves on what we get done on the ground each year. And so last year alone, we planted about 5.2 million trees. For those that aren't aware, Australia's financial year is start of July to end of June, not the calendar year. So we planted 5.2 million trees last year. And they are all responding to those 5 key threshold environmental challenges that I spoke about: climate change, water quality in the Great Barrier Reef, increased urbanising of the cities, et cetera, so all indexed against those strategic challenges. This year we'll plant 7.5 million. You know, the total amount of carbon that was sequestered just from new plantings, so it doesn't take into account the fact that over the last 10 years since I've been with Greening Australia, we put $300 million of activity onto the ground. So just last year, 20,000 tonnes of new carbon is being drawn out of the atmosphere, and that will keep accumulating as these trees continue to grow. And then down the bottom, we still have a very strong connection with the community. So there's about 7,500 volunteers that we engage with every single year. But it's important that you have a forward focus. This is the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So in case I hadn't made the point clearly a bit earlier, Greening Australia is not a conservation organisation. We are a restoration organisation. So we go into country, land that is heavily degraded, highly impacted by a whole range of reasons, and we start restoring it and bringing it back to life. Our targets just in Australia for 2030, in line with the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, is about 330,000 hectares. And each year, sequentially, we'll build up to about 1 million tonnes of carbon being sequestered, and we'll plant 500 million trees. It's important to remember that, particularly given last year we planted 5.2 and this year we're planting 7.5, and hopefully I'll be able to explain why those stats are so important in terms of what comes next, and the rest is obviously self-explanatory here. So now getting into something that I think is an important discussion point for Rotary and many people around the world is, you'll often hear that the problem with meeting environmental challenges is money. I'm going to tell you that I don't think that's the problem anymore. I think there's other issues which are the biggest barriers to scaling for real impact. So just by, I won't step you through the grey box to the left-hand side of the screen, but if you look there, there's a lot of money that's sloshing around in the global economic system, ready to go into environmental causes. Just in Australia alone, and some of these direct deals that we're working on are about to land just for Greening Australia, one organisation in one country. There's a lot of money out there. What I think the problem is that there's no shortage of capital, there's a shortage of deals. So money's great, everyone knows the capitalist system, money's great at finding its way to the source, but if in environmental world what you're trying to do is get money onto the ground to take real action, there's a real issue on the other side, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But some of it is about the way that we've, as a community and as a global community, the way that we've tried to address environmental challenges in the past. I'm just going to make the point here as well before I go into this next slide is, if people can see me waving my hands around my head here, it's not because I have a tick or anything, it's because there's a tremendous amount of flies where I am. And I think it's because I'm near a water source, but also because the bushfires that I'll touch briefly on later. We're only about 30 kilometres away from here, and so much habitat's been destroyed. We've seen all this migration of native birds and insects over to what is drought refugia effectively. So I've never seen flies this bad this time of year where I live. But yeah, if you see me doing this, that's me just waving flies away. Okay. Now on your screen, this slide's a little bit blurry, and I apologise for that. So remembering those 2030 goals that I spoke about and the growth in our organisation in the last couple of years, 5 million trees to 7 million, we've pretty much spent the last 5 to 7 years getting ourselves ready for the next decade to deliver at scale. The green line here talks about the growth that we can expect as an organisation if we keep going the way we've always tackled environmental challenges. So this is basically 3-year government grants, generous donations from philanthropists, trusts and foundations providing year-on-year support, etc., which I describe, and a lot of volunteers helping out with the work, by the way. I describe this as organic growth. So this is business as usual, year-on-year growth, etc. And that will show you that by following the green line, that by the time Greening Australia gets to the end of the decade of ecosystem restoration as prescribed by the United Nations, we'll be an organisation that's $100 million per annum of turnover. Look, that's a great story for an organisation to grow from, when I started, we were about 23 million. We're now about 35 million onto 100 million. That's good. But we won't have met our challenges of Vision 2030. So while we've grown the organisation, we haven't met the challenges that we set out to do. If we think about this just in simple dollar terms, Aussie dollars, and you could do a US conversion or a wherever you are, conversion into your own money, this black line here shows you the type of growth that we need to have as an organisation to actually meet our 2030 goals in today's dollars. And I will tell you that by 2030, we need to be turning over about $600 million per annum as an organisation. The key assumption there is that we will get environmental markets working and innovative financing approaches. So blended finance structures, environmental credits like carbon credits, water quality credits, etc., and that will fill the gap. I'm now actually saying to you that that is only part of the challenge. Just as I said there before, there is not a shortage of, it's not that there's a shortage of capital, there's a shortage of deals. So even if on that previous slide, or you just pick this $600 million off here, the thing that I would say to you is, if all that money got unlocked straight away, the sector wouldn't be able to execute it. It would not be able to deliver against the scale of the investment because we simply do not have the barriers, the infrastructure barriers removed out of the way. And I think these are global barriers, by the way. And the one is that we still use a lot of volunteers and a lot of hired labour to plant trees. So we need to use technology. We need to use drones for mapping, for tree planting. We need to use 24-hour production cycles like industry does. And we need to unlock barriers around land and seed. We also need to have enhanced capability around people, process and partnerships. So if I look at the profile of the Greening Australia workforce in the last couple of years, we've employed resource economists, we've employed engineers, we've employed technology process experts, etc. And it's all about this concept here of unlocking barriers. And in the Rotary context, which is where I think Rotary is expert at, is creating an ecosystem where you replicate great ideas and great initiatives all the way around the planet. So in a nutshell, the way that I would describe this slide here, because this is the key to our Vision 2030 and the planet moving forward on great ecosystem challenges, is we simply cannot do business as usual and think that we're going to meet the challenges of the day. However, for a Rotarian who may be thinking, what can I do? It is still an absolute part of the mix to donate money and donate time and plant trees by the traditional method. However, we also need to ensure that we unlock the finance in a couple of ways by supporting good policy around environmental credit markets and innovative finance. What you might therefore do at a personal level is you may shift some of your own personal portfolio across into ESG. And then on the other side is we need to invest in technology and capability and a platform style approach rather than a pipeline approach to actually ensure that we can scale proportionate to the level of capital that's available. I want to briefly touch on this, which is our role in bushfires. I haven't tried to gloss over this unnecessarily. It's very, very important, but the reality is for Australians is that bushfires and the increased threat of bushfires is something that we live with on a year-to-year basis. Last year was the worst bushfires that we've ever seen, and you know, 1 billion animals alone were killed in the bushfires. And the key role that Greening Australia is playing here is developing a national seed and landscape restoration strategy as part of a increasingly resilient but fire-sensitive landscape. I am very conscious of time here, so I'm going to keep moving. In this slide deck, there is a video which pretty much captures everything that I've spoken about so far and summarises it all in a 3-minute video. I won't show it just in the interest of time, because I know you've got other things you need to get to. But what I will also finish on before we take some questions is just point you towards a couple of links that I've got in here, which goes back to how I think Rotarians can get involved, which is a traditional way of getting involved for a donation of time and money, thinking about how technology and innovation works in terms of scaling ecosystem restoration to meet the great challenges of the day. And then finally, the thinking around market-based approaches to restoration. So Pat, I will pause there now just because of time. We started a little bit late, but I know you need to get back on track.
Appreciate that, Brendan. I'm just wondering if there are any questions from anybody. I have just one perhaps. Could you just sum up again the advice that you would give to all the Rotarians that are listening today and who will be listening in the future through these broadcasts about how they can do their bit to green the world?
Okay, thanks.
Apart from the big picture stuff, but how can what can they be doing?
Yes, so well, as Rotarians, individual Rotarians, and as you said there earlier, Pat, I'm very familiar with Rotary. I was a group study exchange participant back in 2011, and my journey with Rotary actually started a lot longer before that. So I'm as familiar as you can be with Rotary as a non-Rotarian. I've always been a little bit surprised that environment hasn't sat higher in your focus areas, given the global network that you have. So I'd very much encourage you within your groups to push for environment to take a higher profile in Rotary. Secondly, it's very, very easy to get involved in local activities. In Australia, we would call it a land care group or a friends of group, or simply just by making a donation around tax time each year. There's so many things that you can do at an individual level, such as plant a tree, donate some of your time. If you've got a background as an accountant, you might be able to join a local environment organisation and help manage their finances. As I said there before, the people that we've employed in Greening Australia in the last couple of years have a breadth of skills and experience that we've never seen in our sector before. And Rotarians are a highly skilled, capable group. And what I don't think you need to do is reinvent the wheel and start your own programs that compete with the existing environmental organisations. I think Rotary needs to think at 2 levels, Pat. Number one is how can I as an individual best contribute and what's my skill set, and find a way to actually allocate your skills into that. But secondly, if you have a look at what's happening around the world at the moment, and particularly in Australia, is governments and institutions are struggling to coordinate and collaborate and communicate, etc. Rotary is best in class at that. At using this ecosystem model, this international network of capability, at moving skills and network and influence around in a coherent network. Is the environment needs that. The environment needs that, which is why I'm saying if environment's a focus area, Rotary has a big contribution to make in that area. So I would encourage you, Pat, to think at 2 levels, is the individual level, 3 levels, the individual level within your club and your district, and then thirdly, within that club and district at an international level, how you can contribute. And hopefully I've been able to answer that.
Thank you, Brendan. I'm sure everyone appreciates the wisdom of your answer. And I might have to move on, and perhaps we can respond to other questions at a later time. So look, thank you very much, Brendan, for Your amazing story today of the work of Greening Australia about restoring Australia's natural environment, and I'm sure people have learned a great deal that they could take back to their own situation in their own countries from around the world. So I think now I'll just move on to the final wrap up. So thank you, Brendan.
Thank you.
Now, in our celebration of World Environment Day, we've heard from 4 wonderful speakers who have given us a wealth of information, many insights and numerous suggestions for action, but have also presented us with a number of challenges about creating a sustainable future for current and future generations. We first heard from Liz Bernard and Daniel Cooney from UNEP about the United Nations 50th World Environment Day. We learned about the partnership between UNEP and ESRAG and how this generated the World Environment Day Handbook, issues around biodiversity and the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. Some challenges include how each of us can take the examples and suggestions in the handbook back to our own clubs and districts and involve others in World Environment Day projects for 2021, while keeping in mind all 17 of the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. In particular, as Liz said, goals 12 to 16. Daniel and Liz urged Rotarians to have a voice on environmental issues and for communities to take action on a local level and to raise awareness that nature is essential for all human societies. In essence, to be part of the global solution. We heard from Joe Richardson about the important issues of hunger and food waste and how one Rotarian mobilised hundreds of thousands of children to reduce the food waste in their schools. One challenge that arose from Joe's talk is how can we apply Joe's story, his inspirational story, to schools in our own cities and our own districts. And the second is how to channel the concerns and anger of so many young people about environmental issues towards waste and climate solutions. And I remind you about the Lunch Out of Landfill toolkit on the ESRAG's website. So thank you for that, Joe. Jonathan Foley, Executive Director for Operation Drawdown, told us about the concept of drawdown and solutions for, as he called it, bending the curve, and the exciting new partnership between his organisation and ESRAG. And the challenge that arose from his talk is how can we apply the approach of drawdown to our own lives and introduce them to our own clubs and districts. And finally, we heard from Brendan Forum about the amazing work of Greening Australia in restoring Australia's natural environment and reducing siltation of our iconic Great Barrier Reef. How can we involve our own clubs and districts to take action that will help restore our natural environment? And on a larger scale, remember Brendan said, how can Rotary help create deals for these projects? And he finally finished up by saying, it cannot be just business as usual, but we could be involved in unlocking so many of the barriers that are out there. And I'm sure that his theme of healthy landscapes where people and nature thrive resonated with us all. The 4 presentations and challenges that emerged from them all have a common theme. We know about environmental problems and there are practical solutions that we as Rotarians can adopt already. We just need to make a commitment to take action. And as William James once said, act as if what you do make a difference. It does. Earlier today, I mentioned a project that's become part of the ANSPI regional chapter, Rotarians for Bees. This project is all abuzz and has certainly taken wing. One of the phenomenal innovations of Rotarians for Bees is the Waggle Dance Challenge. And I would like to end the webinar on a high note and show you a special video of the Waggle Dance Challenge. But before we show the video, allow me to give you some background. The Waggle Dance was initially planned as a unique centrepiece for a honey festival being planned by the Rotary Club of Canterbury. The club felt they needed a fun event that would create awareness about the importance of bees and other pollinators, and around which they could build a festival. They were supported in their efforts by Rotarians for Bees. Now, a first live Waggle Dance event was planned in Melbourne for the 31st of May this year, with the intention to set a world record for the greatest number of people engaging in a live performance of the dance. But then came the coronavirus. And during the COVID-19 emergency, the Rotary Club of Canterbury and Rotarians for Bees were approached by the Ween Bee Foundation to take the Waggle Dance online as part of celebrations for World Bee Day. Together, the three organisations created the Global Waggle Dance Challenge to collect 20,000 videos from 20 countries representing the 20,000 known species of bees. On World Bee Day, the first compilation video of the uploaded dances was launched. Of course, 20,000 uploads could not be achieved in the month prior to World Bee Day, so the Global Waggle Dance Challenge has been extended to the end of the year. Individuals and groups all over the planet are invited to submit their rendition of the Waggle Dance. A second, bigger compilation video is planned for release in January 2021. And there'll be a big drive to get hundreds of uploads during Pollinator Week in November 2020. And the organisers look forward to receiving videos from people of all ages and across the nations of the world. To date, the oldest waggler is 87 years old. Now let me play you the first compilation of waggle dances with an introduction by Costa Georgiadis, the popular host of the ABC Australia program.
Hi everyone, it's Costa here, and I am so excited to be riding the wave of momentum that you have all helped contribute towards around World Bee Day 2020. And right now, it's an absolute pleasure to be able to share with you the Waggle Dance compilation video. I know that many of you have contributed a video, but if you haven't, don't worry, because you've got the entire year ahead to keep building the awareness. And what we'd love you to do is inspire and engage more family members, your neighbours, work colleagues, friends, and get them all doing the waggle dance. Because what our goal is to see 20,000 waggle dance videos compiled by the end of the year. And that would represent a video for every one of the 20,000 bee species that exist on our wonderful planet. But why stop there? When it comes to our pollinators, there's so many incredible species out there doing work behind the scenes. We've got moths, we've got butterflies, we've got hoverflies, we've got dragonflies, we've got birds, we've got microbats. And imagine a video for each and every one of them as well, so that we just keep raising awareness around the roles that they do. They need us, we need them, we all need each other. Keep the buzz going. Let's do it for our pollinators. Bzzz.
We need plants, plants need us. Buzz, 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 buzz. We need plants, plants need us. Buzz, 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 buzz. Waggle, 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 waggle. Waggle, 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 waggle. Buzz, 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 buzz. Buzz, 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 buzz. Run to the left. Buzz, buzz, to the left, buzz, buzz, buzz. Waggle your behind. Buzz, 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 buzz. Run to the right. Buzz, buzz, to the right, buzz, buzz, buzz. Waggle your behind. Buzz, 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 buzz. Add some style to make you smile. Add some style to make you smile. Add some style to make you smile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Send the message down the line. Turn around, get back in time.
Wow, I hope you all enjoyed that. I'll hand over now to Dr. Chris Puttick, who's the chair of ESRAG, to wind up the wonderful webinar we've had today. Over to you, Chris.
So that's a really great place to finish, because it really shows that everybody, all ages, can join in with activities around Rotary. And certainly pollinators, really important. How can you, as a Rotary, a part of the Rotary family, now get involved with what we do? Firstly, you could join ESRAG and one of its 12 chapters, regional chapters around the world. These regional chapters are very, very wide. So there's a regional chapter for Africa and South Asia, and so we really like you to join in there as you join ESRAG. You can join a Rotary Club or an Interact Club, or and there's certainly going to be one near you. Then when you're in a Rotary Club, there's the opportunity to ask your district governor to have an environmental chair or something similar to that for your district. And it's the environment really a central focus within your district. So there are a myriad of ways to get involved, and everybody can have a part in reducing our footprint on our fragile planet. So thank you for watching today, and hope to see you soon around the Rotary wheel. Thank you.